In the last episode, I went over the verbiage employed in Leviticus 18:18 and saw how that same Hebraic verbiage was employed by Laban in his covenant with Jacob. And understanding how Laban employed that verbiage gave us a better understanding of how that verbiage is to be understood when it was utilized in Leviticus 18:18. And I want to keep that in mind as we go through this series and understand how to interpret the Bible based on how people in the Bible interpret it. And there is no greater example to look to on how to interpret the Bible than Jesus himself, which is who I want to look to in interpreting a particular passage in the Old Testament that also addresses polygamy in Deuteronomy 21. If a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him children, and if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then on the day when he assigns his possessions as an inheritance to his sons, he may not treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the first fruits of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Now, there's really no debate as to what this passage teaches. All sides are pretty much in agreement that this passage teaches a man how he is to maintain a polygamous household, how he is to treat multiple wives. And it baffles my mind how anyone could be against polygamy just in principle when this law here is explicit proof of God teaching men how they are to do it and how to do it rightly. How to do it rightly. I wonder if the critic will agree with that statement, by the way. The statement that this law from God teaches men how to maintain two wives in a righteous manner. Are they going to accuse God of teaching men how to do it in an unrighteous manner? See, they won't publicly say that, but that is their belief, the critic's belief. I went over in the first two episodes of the series how those critics will employ certain code words and phrases such as, quote, God didn't endorse it, or, quote, it isn't the ideal. And in their effort to communicate to Christians that polygamy is sinful evil, and they do it without owning up to the fact that what they are actually doing is accusing God of protecting and teaching evil wickedness. That God is caving in. He's caving in on his own holiness so as to appease the depravity of man, which is a ghastly thing to even imply. But yet, another phrase the critic will employ is something along the lines of, quote, God didn't allow it, but rather he tolerated it. And I encourage you to go back to watch the first two episodes of this series, especially if you haven't seen it before, because where I address those interpretations, I just want to take this episode to show how Jesus himself interpreted passages such as these, because what the critic will say is that this verse in particular from Deuteronomy 21 is not an endorsement or an allowance of polygamy, because it starts with the word if. That if a man is to do such a thing is not the same as saying it is okay that a man do such a thing. But if you'll remember all the way back in the first two episodes where we covered the law of divorce in Deuteronomy 24, that same law also starts with the word if. Remember what it says in that portion of Deuteronomy 24 that speaks on divorce. If then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Now, when the Pharisees presented Deuteronomy 24, that passage, to Jesus, this specific law to Jesus, they said that, why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce to her and send her away? Their question does not assume that it is unlawful to divorce a wife, but rather that it was lawful, to the point where it was commanded even. And Jesus says in response, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. Notice how Jesus responds in his correction of them. Jesus doesn't say that it was commanded. He says that it was allowed. Big difference there. It was allowed. But Jesus interprets the law on divorce in Deuteronomy 24 as God allowing man to divorce his wife, even though that law starts with the word if. There is an understanding that God would not at all protect or provide for any evil practices in Israel, even in conditional scenarios. God is not a God that says, well, I don't want you to murder, but if you're going to do it, at least use a knife and don't stab more than 20 times. No. God cannot even look upon sin. We can't say that God ever allows it. And if Jesus is saying that God is giving an allowance for a command that starts with a conditional if statement in the book of Deuteronomy, when it concerns divorce, then it necessarily also means that Jesus is saying that God is giving an allowance for a command that starts with a conditional if statement in the book of Deuteronomy when it concerns polygamy. The critic cannot fall back on that if word as an escape hatch to avoid the plain meaning and teaching of God's law, because Jesus' interpretation of God's law doesn't allow for it. Now, I don't want people to twist my words and accuse me of saying that anytime the word if is employed in the Bible, that it automatically means the subsequent laws presume allowance. No. Because if a man murders another man, then that man is to be given the death penalty. That does not mean that it is allowed for a man to murder. What I'm saying is, in order to know if an action is a sin or not, when reading through the law, we have to know if the law is dealing with that action in a manner that is protective or punitive. Giving a man the death penalty is certainly punitive. So it is easy to see that that law is a prohibition of the action being described. It's sin. But if there is no punishment given for a certain action, and there is only regulation on how to conduct that action, then it is a form of protection by the law, and it is not a sin. It's my contention that the law of God never, ever, ever protects sin. And the only times the law deals with and addresses sin, even in the conditionals, is to punish it or to correct it. That's it. Never to protect it. And the law in Deuteronomy 21 on how a man is to lead his two wives and their children, nowhere does it punish a man for having two wives. And nowhere does it correct or get the man out of the polygamous household that he has built. The letter of this law addresses how a man is to pass on his inheritance when married to more than one wife. And I would also like to suggest that the spirit of this law, the intention behind it, is also to address that the man's love should not be reserved to only one of his wives or a favored wife, because the law of inheritance here is giving here a protection to the wife, the unloved wife, and to her firstborn children from the weaknesses of the man's heart, so that she and her children can receive everything that they are entitled to for perpetuating the name of Israel.